On the continuum between churches where people dress up and churches where people dress down, we've always been what you'd call a casual dress congregation. That's been our motto from the very beginning. Come as you are. We've always dressed comfortably here at Chapel Hill Christian, and now with COVID-19, those of you who listen to these meditations get to dress even more comfortably. And I get to dress really comfortably to record them. And we'll just leave that image right there. So this story about the underdressed guest may leave some of us with a bad taste in our mouths. What did the king expect? If you're going to go out into the streets and recruit guests at the last minute, how can you expect them to be wearing the right clothes? With all due respect, Your Highness, either give them time to go home and change or lower your standards. No one walks around in wedding robes just in case they happen to be invited to a royal banquet. Scholars say that wedding hosts provided garments for their guests in those days, the same way some elegant restaurants still keep spare ties and jackets on hand for dinner guests who show up in shirt sleeves. If that was the case, then the spotlight shifts from the king to the guest. Why did he refuse the robe that was offered him? What made him think he could come as he was to such an auspicious feast without being noticed? Either way, this is no ordinary story. It's an elaborate allegory. Everything has a deeper meaning. Our first clue is the opening line. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. Gee, who do we think that son could be? Our second clue is the outrageousness of the plot. How many people do we know that would murder the postal carrier for delivering a wedding invitation? And how likely is it that a wedding banquet would stay warm while a king mobilized his troops, declared war, and burned a whole city to the ground? Are you kidding me? By the time all that had happened, the roast would be seriously overdone. There's no way to handle this story without knowing the story behind it, which was Jesus's disappointment and Matthew's after him. But so few of God's people were responding to the invitation to celebrate with God's Son. The prophets had invited them, but some of them had killed the prophets. Then in AD 70, Jerusalem was sacked by Rome. The temple was demolished right down to its retaining walls, which some interpreted as fire from heaven. Then, largely through the efforts of Paul, the Jewish community of Christ's followers was open to Gentiles, the second shift of invited guests, and new controversy set in. The latecomers, the Gentiles who had no history with the God of Israel, acted as if grace gave them permission to live any way they wanted to. And the old-timers, the Hebrews who had known God forever, were still trying to figure out what it meant for them to be free from the law of the Torah. Pretty soon, the early church had a discipline problem on its hands, as believers bellied up to God's table with no sense of what it meant to be there. As far as they were concerned, you showed up in God's presence however you wanted to show up, because Jesus had squared everything with God forever. The invitation to the heavenly banquet was, come as you are. All were welcome and nothing was required. No fancy clothes, no etiquette, no RSVP. Wrong, Matthew said to his congregation. Being an invited guest does not mean you may do as you please. Being invited at the last minute does not mean anything goes. People of God, you've been invited to feast with the King, so rise to the occasion. The undressed guest got bounced because he wouldn't do that. Maybe he thought the king was lucky he came at all. Maybe he thought he was doing the king a favor by showing up to eat food that might otherwise have gone to waste. In which case, he was seriously mistaken about who was doing a favor for whom. Whatever his logic, he didn't rise to the occasion. Instead, he demeaned it by refusing to change. And I'm not talking about clothes either. Like everything else in this story, the wedding robe has a deeper meaning. It's not a white linen tubic robe embroidered with gold thread. It's a whole way of life, one that honors the king, one that recognizes the privilege of being called into his presence, even if the invitation arrives at the last minute. The undressed guest's mistake was not that he showed up in shorts. It was that he showed up short on righteousness and blew it off, thinking no one would care or notice, least of all the king. On the one hand, it's a story that addressed a very particular situation in the life of the early church and no longer has anything to do with us. On the other hand, it happens every week, whether we're gathered together in a building to worship together or gathered together online. And it happens every day. We wake up with another chance to rise to the occasion as God's people, God's servants here on earth. This may not be the heavenly banquet, but it's certainly the rehearsal dinner, where each of us gets a chance to practice our parts. Everyone is invited to be here with us this morning, but more than likely, some of them had other things to do. Some may be at work, some may still be in bed and will listen to this message later on. Some may be at the beach, secluded somewhere in some little nook from as many people and as much exposure to COVID as they can muster. Those of us who are gathered together listening as I'm sharing this message, well, we're no better than any of those who aren't. Remember, just like the story tells us, that when the king's slaves went out to recruit the second batch of guests, they gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. But like the underdressed guest, we all come to God at times without thinking about it. We show up with our spiritual shirt tails hanging out, lining up at the buffet table as if no one could see the ways in which we've refused to change, refusing to surrender our fears and resentments, refusing to share our wealth, refusing to respect the dignity of every human being. These are the old clothes we wear to the king's banquet, the clothes we prefer to the wedding robe of new life, and they are as painful to the king as a bride dressed in black. The truth is, some of us didn't think it mattered. In most parts of the world, there are so few people involved in church these days that social scientists call this the post-Christian era. Most churches are happy for anyone they can get, and some of them spend small fortunes on advertising campaigns. Like the king's slaves, they're beating the bushes for anyone they can find to fill the wedding hall, even if it is on Zoom or Facebook Live. So no wonder there are lots of folks who've gotten the message that showing up is all that really matters. The underdressed guest thought the king was just looking for warm bodies, and he was happy to oblige. He was happy to eat the king's food and enjoy the king's music, if that would help the king out. That was just what he thought he was doing, too, when the king walked right up to him. "Friend," he said, saying it the way a police officer says it the way she does after stopping us on the road, just before asking us if we know how fast we were going. Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe? We can do that in shorts and running shoes, I think, as well as we can do it in suits or designer shoes, because our wedding robes aren't made out of denim or silk. Our wedding robes are made from the whole fabric of our lives, using patterns God has given us. Patterns of justice, forgiveness, loving kindness, peace. Like thousands of my clergy colleagues across the country, I recently received a letter from an organization called Faith and Blue, encouraging me to participate in the National Faith and Blue Weekend, October 9th through the 12th. An event dedicated to facilitate safer, stronger, and more just and unified communities by facilitating collaborations between officers and local residents through the connections of houses of worship. Reading the letter made me think of my clergy colleagues who are Mennonites. As part of the Anabaptist tradition, Mennonites recognize that we live within a world of competing loyalties, but our sole allegiance is to Jesus Christ, God who came in the body of a member of an ethnic minority and was murdered by the state. Because of this, Mennonites, like we in the Disciples of Christ tradition, do not take oaths. But Mennonites also don't participate in institutions like policing and the military, institutions that ask us to enact state violence on people made in the image of God. It's an absurd and radical conviction which has a history of getting Mennonites killed. When Anabaptists refused to participate in the First World War, a group of them were thrown into a military prison in Leavenworth, Kansas. Two of these men, the Hofer brothers, were refused water and thrown naked into a freezing cellar. For days, their hands were tied to rods above their heads, with their feet barely touching the ground. Eventually, they died from this torture. American citizens in an American military prison. Despite this history, Mennonites are a people called to peace and reconciliation. They're pacifists. And that's a language that the people behind Faith and Blue understand. The letter in the group's website brim with calls for bridge building and an end to bias. They suggest relational connections built over meals and in dialogue. They plead for unity marches with police and prayer vigils for officers. The same day I received the Faith and Blue letter, the Raleigh News and Observer reported on the release of police body camera footage from protests in Raleigh following the death of George Floyd. We already knew that officers in Raleigh in riot gear deployed expired tear gas against protesters who threw rocks at them. Now, there's footage of police shooting the canisters directly at protesters. In footage from another camera, an officer in an armored vehicle remarks, "As much as I love chasing people down on foot, it's so much fun watching them run when we're here inside the gator. They just effing fall," another chokes. Officers laugh together after one of them says, "I'm going to say we grab at least 3 more people tonight." They denigrate protesters, call them names, even curse them. The footage shows other officers assisting protesters, in one case helping a man with glass in his hand. And moments like these are, well, they're sure to fuel the both sides-ism many people appeal to and in response to protests against policing across the country. Faith in Blue, after all, is not asking clergy to become educated on the long history of police brutality and failed reforms, or to support policy changes proposed by members of impacted communities. Instead, the group calls for churches to cushion the blow of police brutality and to help clean up officers' public image. This isn't a new strategy. In 1963, sitting in Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King Jr. penned a letter to white religious leaders excoriating them for their tolerance and acceptance of policing tactics used against the civil rights movement. Near the end of the letter, King writes, "You warmly commended the Birmingham police force for keeping order and preventing violence. I doubt that you would have so warmly commended the police force if you had seen its angry dogs sinking their teeth into 6 unarmed, non-violent Negroes," King writes. Just a generation later, the church, and especially white moderate churches, was already whitewashing the civil rights movement. But King didn't pin the atrocities of racism on notorious individual cops like Bull Connor, but instead on the entire policy of the United States government. Because of this, King's tactics were considered inflammatory. He was accused of inciting violence, told he was advancing a radical agenda, pushing it too fast. Faith in Blue provides opportunities to share mission statements and eat hot dogs with the police, to play football and ask questions about the impact of the group's efforts on cities. But the crisis it purports to address will not be solved with stories or picnics. Solving it requires policymakers, churches, and others to align themselves with a different vision for safety and community care, led by the communities most deeply impacted by the justice system. The problem in this is not a failure to see that there are both good and bad police officers. It's not that Black people aren't familiar with their local beat cop. It's not that the call for abolition is too fast, too aggressive, or too polarizing. The problem is our acceptance of a broken system. We people of faith are once again in a moment at which we will be asked to choose what kind of love we offer to the world. Will it be conflict avoidance that projects equal measures of blame on police and on people of color? Or is it time finally to demand a new world, to put ourselves in the service of those who work toward a social order without the birth to prison pipeline, without the criminalization of homelessness and sex work, without deadly encounters between police and people in mental health crises? Those patterns I mentioned that God has given us, patterns of justice, forgiveness, loving kindness, and peacemaking, are based on the belief that every person is made in the image of God. When we focus on stitching them up and putting them on, we are gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. And when we do that, we are rising to the occasion. God's not asking us to gloss over conflict or to entrench hatred for the police, but endless cycles of violence and destruction are bad for all of us. It's time for a new way of life. It will be difficult and costly. It will divide natural allegiances and unite people in unexpected places. It will be angry, difficult, and painful. It will call systems of violence to account. But it's time, as Rodney Sadler writes, for the church to take a lead in our country and call for a process that will finally overcome what Jim Wallace has called America's original sin. It's time for the church to manifest the reconciling power of Christ and bring about a world commensurate with God's vision of humanity. Time for the church to commit once and for all to the full humanity and equality of all God's children, and to do everything we can to bring this about. The full humanity and equality of all God's children. That's rising to the occasion. What a beautiful wedding dress that will be for us to see. Thanks be to God. Amen.